When British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before the press in January 1945 and delivered what would become the most controversial remarks of the Allied partnership, remarks that painted American forces as disorganized amateurs, saved only by British intervention. He ignited a firestorm that nearly tore apart the Western alliance. This is the story of how one man's arrogance almost cost the Allies everything they had fought for, and how American commanders responded with a reckoning that would reshape the command structure for the remainder of the war. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. In the pre-dawn darkness, German artillery shattered the winter silence along an 85-mile front. Operation Whacked 'em Rhine, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, had begun. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,400 tanks and assault guns, crashed into positions held by just 83,000 American soldiers. What followed would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. But the real battle, the one that threatened to destroy Allied unity, would be fought not with tanks and rifles, but with words. To understand how Montgomery's comments nearly shattered the Anglo-American alliance, we must first understand the delicate balance of egos and national pride that characterized Allied command in late 1944. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, had the unenviable task of managing not just military operations, but the political sensitivities of two proud nations fighting side by side. By December 1944, the Allied advance across France had slowed to a crawl. Supply lines stretched thin from the Normandy beaches. The port of Antwerp, though captured in September, remained unusable until late November due to German forces controlling the Scheldt estuary. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Monty to his troops, commanded the 21st Army Group in the north, while American General Omar Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group in the center, and General Jacob Devers led the 6th Army Group in the south. Montgomery had been pushing Eisenhower for weeks to adopt his strategy, a single, concentrated thrust into Germany under British command, specifically, his command. He believed the American approach of advancing on a broad front was wasteful and slow. Eisenhower had consistently rejected this proposal, unwilling to give overall ground command to Montgomery and unwilling to halt Patton's Third Army and other American forces to concentrate resources in the north. This disagreement simmered beneath the surface of Allied cooperation, a wound waiting to be reopened. The relationship between Montgomery and his American counterparts had never been warm. After Market Garden, Montgomery's ambitious plan to seize bridges across the Rhine in September 1944 ended in costly failure at Arnhem. American generals had grown increasingly skeptical of British strategic vision. Montgomery, for his part, viewed American commanders as tactically unsophisticated, too willing to rely on material superiority rather than careful planning. When German forces erupted from the Ardennes on December 16, they struck a sector of the front held primarily by inexperienced American divisions recuperating from earlier battles, and by new units just arrived from the States. The WWII Corps under Major General Troy Middleton bore the brunt of the assault. The 106th Infantry Division, which had been in combat for less than a week, found itself surrounded. The 28th Infantry Division, still recovering from savage fighting in the Huitjen forest, was shattered across a 25-mile front. Within 48 hours, German spearheads had penetrated up to 20 miles into American lines. Panic spread through Belgian villages as civilians fled westward. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, the magnitude of the German offensive became horrifyingly clear. This was not a local counterattack, but a massive offensive involving 3 entire German armies, the 6th Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, and the 7th Army in the south. Eisenhower faced an immediate crisis of command and control. The German penetration had split Bradley's 12th Army Group in two, with 1st Army under General Courtney, Hodges north of the Bulge, and Patton's 3rd Army to the south. Communication between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and Hodges' 1st Army became tenuous as German forces threatened key road junctions. On December 20, Eisenhower made a decision that was militarily sound but politically explosive. He temporarily transferred command of all American forces north of the Bulge, Hodges' 1st Army and Simpson's 9th Army to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The logic was clear. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern shoulder of the German penetration. Communication lines were secure. Montgomery could coup. Ardennes the defense of the northern flank, while Bradley focused on Patton's counterattack from the south. It was a practical arrangement, meant to last only until the crisis passed. But to Bradley, it felt like a slap in the face. To Montgomery, it felt like vindication, proof that Eisenhower should have given him overall ground command months ago. And to the American soldiers fighting and dying in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the change in command structure meant little compared to the desperate fight for survival they were waging against overwhelming German forces. Montgomery arrived at Hodges' headquarters on December 20, wearing his trademark beret and radiating confidence that bordered on condescension. According to American officers present, he swept in like Christ come to cleanse the temple, immediately questioning American dispositions and issuing orders in a manner that suggested he was rescuing incompetent subordinates from their own mistakes. He ordered the consolidation of scattered American units, the establishment of a more coherent defensive line, and the preparation of reserves to counterattack once German momentum was exhausted. To be fair, some of Montgomery's actions were militarily sound. He did help stabilize a confused situation. He did ensure that reserves were properly positioned. He did coordinate the defense of key terrain along the Meuse River in case German forces broke through. But his manner, his evident belief that British leadership was rescuing American failure, grated on every American officer who dealt with him. By December 26, the crisis had peaked and begun to recede. Patton's 3rd Army had relieved the surrounded 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. German spearheads, starved of fuel and unable to capture Allied supply dumps, had ground to a halt short of the Meuse River. American reinforcements were flowing into the battle faster than the Germans could sustain their offensive. The weather had cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to hammer German columns. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over. Fighting would continue into January, but the immediate crisis had passed. On January 7, 1945, with the Ardennes battle still ongoing but clearly turning in the Allies' favor, Montgomery held a press conference at his headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium. What he said in the next 30 minutes would create a diplomatic crisis that threatened to overshadow the military victory being won in the frozen forests to the south. Montgomery began by praising the fighting qualities of the American soldier, calling them brave and resilient. But then he pivoted to what he clearly saw as the main point, how British leadership had salvaged the situation. He described how he had taken command of American forces in the north when the German attack created a definite threat. He spoke of how he had employed the whole available power of the British group of armies to meet the crisis. He described British troops moving south to secure the Meuse crossings and prevent a German breakthrough. The words themselves might have been forgiven. After all, Montgomery had commanded American forces during the crisis, and British XXX Corps had indeed moved to defensive positions along the Meuse. But Montgomery's tone, his manner, the clear implication of his remarks, suggested something far more damaging. That American command had failed, that American forces had been on the verge of collapse, and that only British intervention under his brilliant leadership had prevented catastrophe. He described the battle as if he had been its master conductor, orchestrating a symphony of defensive operations while American forces played supporting roles. He used phrases like, "I was thinking ahead," and "I took certain steps," that made it sound as though American generals had been paralyzed by the crisis. He suggested that the German attack had succeeded because of American failures in intelligence and defensive preparation, failures that his superior experience had corrected. The British press, hungry for a victory to celebrate after years of retreat and stalemate, seized on Montgomery's narrative. Headlines proclaimed British generalship saving American forces. Editorial writers praised Montgomery's tactical genius. The implication was clear and deeply insulting. American forces, for all their numbers and equipment, still needed British brains to win battles. When reports of Montgomery's press conference reached American headquarters, the reaction was one of stunned fury. Bradley was livid, calling Montgomery's remarks a shocking misrepresentation of the facts. Patton, never one for diplomatic restraint, wrote in his diary that Montgomery was a tired little fart who should be fired immediately. Even the normally diplomatic Eisenhower was reported to be furious at Montgomery's self-aggrandizement. The American press responded with equal heat. Correspondents who had covered the Ardennes battle knew at American troops, particularly the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions on the northern shoulder, and countless other units, had fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds. They knew that Patton's Third Army had executed a 90-degree turn and relieved Bastogne in less than a week, a feat of operational mobility unprecedented in military history. They knew that British involvement, while helpful, had been peripheral to the main battle. Articles appeared questioning Montgomery's actual contribution to the victory. The New York Times noted pointedly that British casualties in the Ardennes had been minimal compared to the 80,000 American casualties. Other papers questioned why, if British leadership was so superior, Operation Market Garden had ended in failure, while American operations in France had liberated the country. The Transatlantic Alliance, which had survived strategic disagreements and operational setbacks, was now threatened by wounded national pride and one man's inability to share credit. The crisis came to a head in mid-January when Bradley confronted Eisenhower with an ultimatum. Either Montgomery's command over American forces would end immediately and permanently, or Bradley would resign. It was not an empty threat. Bradley, normally the most moderate and diplomatic of senior American commanders, had been pushed beyond his breaking point. And if Bradley resigned over Montgomery's continued influence, Patton would likely follow, and the entire American command structure would be thrown into chaos. Eisenhower faced the most difficult decision of his tenure as Supreme Commander. Montgomery was a skilled, if methodical, battlefield commander. British political leadership strongly supported him. Churchill himself had defended Montgomery against American criticism. To remove Montgomery from command of American forces, or worse, to relieve him entirely, would create a diplomatic incident that could reach the highest levels of the Anglo-American alliance. But Eisenhower also knew that he could not afford to lose Bradley. American forces now comprised the majority of Allied strength in Western Europe. The final offensives into Germany would depend on American divisions, American logistics, American industrial might. And more fundamentally, Eisenhower knew that Bradley was right. Montgomery's press conference had been an inexcusable breach of Allied solidarity, a self-serving distortion of events that insulted every American soldier who had fought in the Ardennes. On January 16, Eisenhower called Montgomery to a private meeting at SHAEF headquarters. What was said in that meeting has never been fully documented, but the results were clear. Montgomery would retain command of 21st Army Group, but all American forces, including Simpson's 9th Army, would be returned to Bradley's command as soon as operations permitted. Montgomery would issue no further press statements about the Ardennes battle without prior approval from SHAEF. And most significantly, Montgomery would send a personal letter to Bradley expressing regret for any misunderstanding his remarks had caused. The letter, dated January 21, 1945, was as close to an apology as Montgomery's pride would allow. He wrote that he was distressed that my press conference may have been misinterpreted, and that he had nothing but admiration for the fighting qualities of the American soldier. He acknowledged Bradley's leadership and expressed hope that they could continue to work together effectively. It was a carefully worded document, drafted with SHAEF input, designed to defuse the crisis without requiring Montgomery to admit he had been wrong. But the real reckoning came not in private letters, but in operational reality. Eisenhower had made his decision. The final offensives into Germany would be conducted primarily by American forces under American command. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would play a supporting role in the north, but the main drives across the Rhine and into the German heartland would be led by Bradley's 12th Army Group and Devere's 6th Army Group. When Montgomery continued to lobby for a single thrust under his command, Eisenhower finally drew a hard line. In a letter dated March 31, 1945, Eisenhower made clear that American forces would cross the Rhine on a broad front, would encircle the Ruhr industrial region, and would drive east toward the Elbe to meet Soviet forces. Montgomery's proposal was definitively rejected. The broad front strategy, derided by Montgomery as wasteful and unimaginative, would be the approach that ended the war. The message was unmistakable. Montgomery's moment of influence over American forces had passed. His arrogance had cost him the trust of American commanders and the confidence of the Supreme Commander. He would finish the war as commander of British and Canadian forces only, executing missions assigned by Eisenhower, but no longer able to claim overall direction of Allied operations. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945 with a decisive Allied victory. German casualties exceeded 100,000, including prisoners. Over 800 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. Hitler's last mobile reserves in the West had been shattered, and the road into Germany lay open. American casualties were equally severe. 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. But American forces had absorbed the shock, held critical positions, and counterattacked with speed and violence that surprised German commanders who had expected American collapse. Montgomery's role in this victory, while real, was far smaller than his press conference had suggested. British XXX Corps had indeed secured the Meuse crossings, preventing a potential German breakthrough. Montgomery's headquarters had coordinated defensive operations on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. But the decisive actions, the stand at Bastogne, the defense of the Elson Ridge, Patton's relief attack, the armored battles around Celles, had been fought almost entirely by American forces under American command. In the decades since the war, historians have gradually corrected the record. Montgomery's claims of having saved the American forces in the Ardennes have been thoroughly debunked. Modern analyses credit the successful defense to the courage of individual American units, to Eisenhower's quick reinforcement of the threatened sector, to Patton's operational agility, and to German logistical failures. Montgomery's actual contribution is now understood as useful, but not decisive, exactly the opposite of what he claimed in January 1945. The diplomatic crisis caused by Montgomery's remarks left scars that never fully healed. Bradley never forgave Montgomery for what he saw as a deliberate attempt to claim credit for American sacrifice. Patton's contempt for Montgomery deepened into open hostility. Even Eisenhower, who maintained official cordiality, privately expressed frustration with Montgomery's ego and his inability to function as part of a team. For Montgomery himself, the press conference marked the beginning of his decline in influence. He would continue to command British forces through the end of the war, would accept the German surrender at Lüneburg Heath, and would serve as chief of the Imperial General Staff after the war. But his reputation, particularly in America, never recovered. He would be remembered not as the victor of El Alamein, but as the general whose arrogance nearly destroyed the Western alliance at its moment of greatest trial. The broader lesson of the crisis extended beyond personalities. It demonstrated the fragility of coalition warfare, the importance of managing Allied sensitivities, and the danger of allowing national pride to override strategic necessity. Eisenhower's greatest achievement was not tactical or operational, but diplomatic. He held together an alliance of nations with different strategic cultures, different military traditions, and different expectations of victory. Montgomery's press conference threatened that achievement, and the damage was contained only through Eisenhower's patient diplomacy and his willingness to prioritize alliance unity over personal relationships. The confrontation between Montgomery and the American command in January 1945 stands as a cautionary tale about ego and credit in coalition warfare. One press conference, driven by pride and a desire for recognition, nearly fractured an alliance that had liberated Western Europe from Nazi tyranny. The reckoning that followed, Eisenhower's quiet but firm relegation of Montgomery to a supporting role, ensured that American sacrifice would not be diminished by British arrogance, and that the final campaigns of the war would be fought under command structures that respected the contributions of all Allied nations. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.